In 260 CE, beneath the besieged walls of Edessa in Roman Mesopotamia, the unthinkable happened. A reigning Roman emperor was captured alive on the battlefield by a foreign king. Emperor Valerian had marched east with a massive field army of nearly 70,000 men to break the Sassanid Persian siege, aiming to stabilize a rapidly deteriorating eastern frontier. However, this massive mobilization did not result in a decisive Roman victory. Instead, the campaign ended in the ultimate imperial humiliation, with the supreme commander of the Roman world taken in chains and famously reduced to a human mounting block for King Shapur I's horse. This unprecedented disaster was not the result of a sudden ambush, but the methodical dismantling of an entire military apparatus. The Roman regular troops found themselves entirely paralyzed and locked in place under the blinding glare of the Mesopotamian sun, as it reflected off an unbroken, advancing wall of heavily armored Sassanid cavalry. Welcome back to World Chronicles. In this episode, we break down the disastrous Battle of Edessa. We will analyze the lethal combination of harsh terrain, collapsing supply lines, rampant disease, and fatal command errors that created the perfect strategic trap, leading to the darkest day in the history of the Roman Empire and shattering the illusion of Roman invincibility forever. To understand how a supreme commander of Rome found himself in chains, one must look at the fractured map of the mid-3rd century. Long before Valerian ever set foot in Mesopotamia, the Roman state was already buckling under the weight of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Although the empire was not fighting a single war, it was bleeding from a dozen simultaneous wounds. Along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, massive Germanic confederations, primarily the Franks and the Alemanni, were probing and shattering the northern defensive lines. The pressure was so immense that Valerian was forced to make a drastic, unprecedented command decision upon taking the throne in 253 CE. He split the defense of the Roman world. He left his son and co-emperor, Gallienus, to desperately hold the west, while he took personal command of the collapsing eastern frontier. This division of imperial authority was a pragmatic necessity, but it meant Valerian could not bring the full, undivided might of the Roman military machine to bear. Compounding this strategic nightmare was a silent, internal catastrophe that was rapidly destroying the foundation of the state itself: the plague of Cyprian. Erupting around 249 CE, this pandemic did more than just kill citizens. It systematically dismantled Roman logistics. From an administrative perspective, the plague was a devastating tax and manpower deficit. Depopulated cities meant a shattered tax base, which led to a severely debased currency. More critically, the disease hollowed out the recruitment pools. The legions required a constant influx of healthy fighting-age men and a massive agricultural surplus to feed them. Instead, imperial recruiters found only empty barracks and untended silent fields left to rot under the Mediterranean sun. Consequently, the army Valerian managed to assemble for the Eastern campaign was fundamentally compromised before it even began its march. While the imperial registers boasted a formidable force of nearly 70,000 troops drawn from across the surviving provinces, this was not the seasoned, cohesive war machine of previous centuries. The ranks were diluted, hastily assembled, and already carrying the contagion with them. Valerian was forced to commit a brittle, heavily burdened field army into the harsh, arid theater of northern Mesopotamia, completely severed from the veteran reinforcements that were currently locked in a struggle for survival in Europe. He was walking a geopolitical tightrope, attempting to project overwhelming imperial authority with an army that was decaying from the inside out. Valerian marched east, believing he could stabilize the frontier, unaware that the enemy waiting for him had entirely rewritten the rules of Eastern warfare. For centuries, Rome's Eastern policy had been calibrated to handle the Parthians. a decentralized feudal state whose armies relied on evasive, hit-and-run harassment. But the enemy waiting for Valerian was an entirely different geopolitical beast. By 224 CE, the Arsacid dynasty had been violently overthrown by the Sassanids, who rapidly transformed the fractured Persian realm into a highly centralized, aggressive superpower. At the head of this new empire stood Shapur I, the self-proclaimed King of Kings. As the second ruler of a fledgling dynasty, Shapur's hold on absolute power required constant, undeniable validation. Legitimacy in the Sassanid court was not merely inherited, it was forged through conquest. Humiliating the Roman Empire was the ultimate proof of divine favor, a political necessity to bind his ambitious nobility to the throne. To achieve this dominance, Shapur deployed a military apparatus specifically engineered to dismantle the traditional Roman infantry formation. The new Sassanid doctrine discarded mere border skirmishing in favor of decisive, concentrated shock combat. At the vanguard were the cataphracts, the elite heavy cavalry. When deployed on the flat plains of Mesopotamia, they formed a terrifying unified wall of iron. Heavily armored riders atop scale-draped war horses, advancing with a relentless, mechanical precision that caught the desert sun in blinding flashes. This armored fist was designed to physically crush defensive lines through sheer kinetic mass, while thousands of highly disciplined horse archers operated on the flanks. This combined arms approach allowed the Sassanids to pin Roman cohorts in place with continuous arrow fire, weakening their shields and stamina before the cataphracts delivered the shattering final blow. Rome's military intelligence fundamentally underestimated this evolution, treating Shapur's early incursions into Syria and Mesopotamia as traditional, large-scale raids that could be repelled by a show of imperial force. Shapur, however, understood Roman operational psychology perfectly. He knew that a Roman emperor could never ignore the siege of a major provincial capital without suffering a catastrophic loss of political credibility. By the spring of 260 CE, the King of Kings anchored his invasion force in northern Mesopotamia, cutting regional supply lines and isolating the Roman garrison. He was dictating the operational tempo, forcing Valerian's lumbering, disease-ridden columns to march across exposed, arid terrain entirely on Persian terms. Shapur did not just want to raid Roman territory. He had laid a strategic trap around a single, heavily fortified city, waiting for the emperor to walk into it. As the Roman columns halted outside Edessa to establish their fortified encampment, the invisible enemy they had carried from the Mediterranean finally broke the army's back. The plague of Cyprian tore through the tightly packed rows of leather tents with terrifying speed, immediately compromising the rigid command structure of the legions. In the brutal mathematics of ancient warfare, an army's survival depended entirely on its mobility. Now a sick army cannot march, and a stationary army cannot feed itself. The contagion effectively paralyzed the imperial high command. Valerian could not order a sudden aggressive advance to break the siege without abandoning tens of thousands of stricken, incapacitated legionaries, a decision that would permanently shatter the morale of his remaining effective troops. The Romans found themselves pinned down, not by Persian steel, but by an epidemiological disaster that stripped them of all strategic initiative. Shapur immediately recognized and ruthlessly exploited this logistical paralysis. Understanding that the imperial army was slowly rotting from within, the Sassanid monarch refused to commit his valuable heavy cavalry to a costly frontal assault against entrenched Roman earthworks. Instead, he deployed sweeping screens of light horse archers to throw a wide, impenetrable net around the sprawling Roman camp. Every time Valerian dispatched a cohort to forage for desperately needed grain or to secure access to fresh water sources, they were swiftly outflanked, isolated, and annihilated by the highly mobile Persian patrols. The Roman supply lines were entirely severed, Valerian's vast host of nearly 70,000 men had ceased to be a relief force. They were now hostages trapped within their own defenses, rapidly consuming their final rations while the enemy simply watched and waited. Inside the imperial perimeter, traditional military discipline began to collapse under the weight of sheer mortality. The customary sounds of a Roman legion preparing for war, the organized hum of a functioning military machine, were replaced by the rhythmic, relentless thud of spades digging mass graves in the dry, sun-baked earth. With each passing day, starvation and fever bled the Roman command of its combat effectiveness. The emperor's tactical options evaporated. He was entirely incapable of moving forward into the teeth of the Sassanid cavalry screen, and equally incapable of executing a fighting retreat through an arid wasteland completely devoid of provisions. Trapped between the walls of Edessa and the open desert, Valerian realized too late that Shapur was not preparing for a battle. He was preparing an execution. The defining characteristic of the Roman legion was its aggressive, forward-moving infantry block, a tactical system engineered to close the distance and crush opposing lines in brutal close-quarters combat. At Edessa, however, disease and starvation had robbed the Roman heavy infantry of their essential mobility, forcing them into a rigid, static defense across the flat Mesopotamian plains. Valerian could not organize a concentrated outward push. Any attempt to march out and force a decisive engagement caused his lines to fracture under the sheer physical strain of sickness. Shapur I exploited this paralysis with absolute mechanical efficiency. Instead of committing his forces to a costly direct melee against fortified infantry, the Sassanid king ordered his tens of thousands of horse archers to form a continuous, rotating wheel of fire around the stalled Roman squares. For the legionaries locked in formation, and the engagement became a grueling demonstration of asymmetrical warfare. The Sassanid light cavalry maintained a perfectly calculated distance, remaining safely out of range of Roman javelins while pouring continuous plunging volleys into the tightly packed ranks. Because the Romans were pinned in place and unable to execute a countercharge, they were effectively reduced to a static target. The sheer, unrelenting volume of incoming fire steadily degraded their defensive posture, splintering heavy wooden shields and draining the last reserves of stamina from men already ravaged by fever. It was a methodical, almost industrial dismantling of a trapped army. The air over the battlefield grew dense with the continuous rushing hiss of thousands of arrows in flight, a psychological pressure that slowly shattered unit cohesion. Whenever local Roman commanders attempted desperate, isolated breakouts to relieve this unbearable pressure, they immediately encountered Shapur's ultimate deterrent. The Sassanid king held his elite cataphracts in reserve specifically to contain these maneuvers, deploying them as an impenetrable wall of iron against any advancing Roman cohort. The exhausted legionaries, lacking the numerical density, momentum, and physical strength to absorb a heavy cavalry shock charge, were easily broken and violently driven back into the centralized kill zone. The unforgiving, open geography of the region offered no forests, narrow valleys, or natural choke points that the Romans could use to anchor their flanks or force a bottleneck. They were stranded on an open board, systematically outmaneuvered by a highly specialized adversary. As the days dragged on, casualties from the relentless projectile harassment matched the catastrophic daily death toll of the plague. The structural integrity of the imperial army disintegrated as senior officers and veteran centurions fell, leaving the surviving rank and file isolated in shrinking, disorganized pockets of resistance. Valerian, watching the systematic destruction of his expeditionary force from within the compromised perimeter, recognized that military salvation was no longer a mathematical possibility. With his army bleeding out and supply lines completely severed, the supreme commander of the Roman world was forced to make a decision that would forever stain his legacy. Facing the total annihilation of his diseased and starving legions, Valerian sought a diplomatic exit. While a few Roman sources later attempted to salvage a shred of martial dignity by claiming the emperor was overwhelmed in the chaos of a final infantry charge, the broader historical consensus points to a far more humiliating reality. He was captured during a parley. Valerian, falling back on centuries of Roman precedent, believed he could simply buy his way out of the disaster. He dispatched envoys to the Sassanid camp, offering immense sums of imperial gold in exchange for a secure withdrawal. Shapur I, commanding the battlefield and fully aware that the Roman camp was an active quarantine zone, deliberately stalled the negotiations. He allowed the pestilence to further erode Roman strength for several days before finally agreeing to a face-to-face summit between sovereigns. Driven by sheer desperation and the imminent collapse of his troops, Valerian left the heavily fortified Roman perimeter. He was accompanied only by a modest retinue of senior officers, praetorian prefects, and high-ranking senators. This decision represented a catastrophic breakdown of imperial security protocols. Shapur did not view this meeting as a diplomatic summit between equals. He viewed it as a highly calculated geopolitical decapitation strike. The moment the Roman delegation advanced into the Persian lines, the Sassanids dropped all pretense of negotiation. The emperor and his entire high command were swiftly surrounded and taken alive. The sudden heavy thud of Sassanid heavy cavalry, closing a tight ring around the unarmed Roman delegation, sealed the trap without a single sword being drawn in defense. And the capture of Valerian delivered a psychological and structural shock to the Roman world that is difficult to overstate. A Roman emperor was not merely a supreme general managing a war front. He was the administrative, political, and religious epicenter of the state. As Pontifex Maximus, his physical capture suggested to the ancient mind that the gods had fundamentally abandoned the empire. On a tactical level, his sudden removal instantly paralyzed the entire military apparatus at Edessa. The Sassanids had not just taken a sovereign, they had captured the operational brain of Rome's eastern defenses. Without imperial authorization, the surviving officers inside the camp could not coordinate a breakout, formally ratify a surrender, or even organize a coherent defense. While the remaining Roman forces were instantly transformed from an imperial expedition into hostages stranded in hostile territory. The Roman army was left leaderless and shattered, but for Valerian, the nightmare of captivity was only just beginning. The physical capture of Valerian was only the first phase of Shapur's victory. The second was the deliberate public weaponization of the emperor's physical body as state propaganda. To permanently solidify the legitimacy of the fledgling Sassanid dynasty, Shapur needed his subjects and his rivals to see the King of Kings physically dominating the embodiment of the Roman state. The historical record detailing Valerian's captivity is dominated by visceral, degrading imagery designed to project total submission. According to surviving accounts, the Emperor of Rome was kept in heavy shackles and repeatedly paraded before the Sassanid court and visiting foreign dignitaries. The visual contrast was meticulously engineered for maximum psychological impact. A man still draped in the remnants of the imperial purple, the sacred and exclusive dye denoting Roman supreme authority, now bound heavily in the coarse iron chains of a common prisoner of war. The most infamous detail of this captivity comes down to us from the Christian rhetorician Lactantius, who recorded that whenever the Sassanid monarch intended to mount his horse, he commanded the Roman emperor to drop to his hands and knees. Shapur would then place his boot squarely upon Valerian's back, using the supreme commander of the Roman world as a literal human footstool. It is crucial, however, to maintain a rigorous scholarly perspective on these claims. Lactantius was writing a hostile polemic, possessing a vested ideological interest in portraying the agonizing fate of Valerian, an emperor who had systematically persecuted the early Christian church, as brutal, undeniable divine retribution. Yet, regardless of whether the footstool narrative is literal historical fact or a piece of highly effective religious and political propaganda, its widespread circulation served a precise strategic function. It systematically dismantled the core Roman concept of dignitas, proving to both the Persian nobility and fractured Roman subjects that the emperor was fundamentally vulnerable and that Rome's borders could be broken. Valerian's eventual death in captivity offered no reprieve from this calculated humiliation, as the same hostile historical tradition claims that after the broken emperor finally succumbed to the rigors of his imprisonment, Shapur ordered his corpse to be publicly flayed. Valerian's skin was allegedly tanned, dyed a brilliant, gruesome red, and stuffed with straw or dung to preserve its human shape. This macabre effigy was then suspended high from the ceiling of a prominent Persian temple. It was hung there as a permanent physical warning to any future Roman ambassadors crossing the frontier, a grisly, enduring monument to the total collapse of Rome's supreme office. Through these actions, the Sassanid monarch had successfully transformed a living Roman emperor into a permanent geopolitical trophy, stripping away every layer of imperial mystique. The physical and ideological destruction of Valerian was complete, but the political shockwave generated by his absence was moving faster than any invading army. While Valerian languished in a Persian cage, the news of his unprecedented capture reached the West, setting off an explosion that nearly erased the Roman Empire from the map. This geopolitical explosion shattered the fundamental illusion of Roman supremacy that had held the Mediterranean world together for centuries. Deprived of its supreme commander and paralyzed by the military disaster, the Roman state immediately fractured under the pressure, unable to rely on the central government in Rome or the surviving court under Gallienus for protection. The provincial elites took survival into their own hands. In the West, the provinces of Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania seceded to form the independent Gallic Empire. In the East, the wealthy desert city of Palmyra assumed control of the eastern defenses, eventually carving out the separatist Palmyrene Empire. The unified political entity forged by Augustus ceased to exist, replaced by three competing states desperately fighting to hold off external invasions and internal usurpation. While the Roman world tore itself apart, Shapur I immortalized his unprecedented triumph in stone. At Naqsh-e-Rostam, carved directly into the towering limestone cliffs alongside the tombs of ancient Persian kings, he commissioned massive rock reliefs that still stand today. The monumental carvings depict the Sassanid monarch seated in absolute triumph atop his warhorse, grasping the wrist of a subjugated Roman figure in a traditional gesture of captivity and total submission. This was not mere artistic vanity. It was a permanent and structural declaration of a new world order. The Sassanid Empire had proven it could meet the Roman war machine in open combat, absorb its elite infantry forces, and systematically dismantle them. The strategic cost of the disaster at Edessa forced Rome to fundamentally redesign its way of war. The traditional reliance on heavy infantry legions had proven lethally vulnerable to highly mobile, combined arms cavalry tactics on the eastern plains. In the decades that followed, military reformers and brilliant cavalry commanders were forced to rebuild the shattered state from the ground up. They shifted the Roman military doctrine toward a heavy reliance on mobile field armies, heavily armored cavalry of their own, and a complex strategy of defense in depth. It would take nearly 15 years of relentless, bloody campaigning for the future Emperor Aurelian to finally stitch the broken world back together and restore the imperial borders. The Battle of Edessa remains a stark historical warning about the fragility of absolute power. A mighty empire, commanding tens of thousands of professional soldiers, was brought to its knees not solely by a superior enemy, but by the lethal intersection of overextended logistics, devastating plague, and the rigid inability to adapt to a changing battlefield.
Infantry block.
The image of a Roman emperor reduced to a footstool serves as the ultimate testament that no state, regardless of its size or history, is immune to collapse. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most shocking turning points, subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.